What was the French centre of gravity, and what made the Germans strike right at the heart of it?
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 70 of the Principles of War podcast. This continues on our Battle of France campaign series, and today we're looking at the French centre of gravity and possibly one of the largest mistakes that's ever been made in a terrain analysis. Now, as always, our centre of gravity analysis podcasts, they always come with a warning on the label to state that this is designed to get you to think about it. I've taken a moderately traditional centre of gravity, which many people think is incorrect, but we're going to have a crack at arguing why it is justified to have this as the centre of gravity. The first thing to understand was what it was that the French government was trying to achieve in the interwar period between World War I and the outbreak of World War II. That desired end state, that's going to give us a piece of the puzzle as we look at what is that the French have or can develop that will enable them to achieve that desired end state. To do that, I think we need to look at the strategic situation as well as the development of the French doctrine. So we're probably going to need to go way back to 1870, the Franco-Prussian War. The French mobilised their army on the 15th of July, 1870, and this is before Germany, so we're looking at Prussia, and it is putting together a confederation of states. They mobilised later on that day. On the 16th of July, the French Parliament declares war on Prussia, and France invades Germany on the 2nd of August. However, the German coalition mobilised their troops much more effectively than the French, and they invaded northeastern France on the 4th of August. The German forces were superior in numbers, training, and leadership. They implemented modern technology much more effectively, in particular railways and artillery. There was a series of swift Prussian and German victories in eastern France. There was the Siege of Metz, where an entire French army was bottled up, and the Battle of Sedan, which saw the French Emperor Napoleon III captured and the armies of the Second Empire decisively defeated. The French government declared a Third French Republic in Paris on the 4th of September, and they continued the war for another 5 months. But German forces fought and defeated new French armies in northern France. They besieged Paris for 4 months, and it fell on the 28th of January, 1871. All up, the French had deployed 2 million soldiers against 1.5 million Prussian soldiers. This was the third hit out for the Prussian army following the defeats at Jena and Auerstadt, which led to the development of the Prussian staff system. The war with Denmark in 1864 hadn't been that successful for the Prussians, although they did win, but many of the lessons from the general staff hadn't been actually implemented by the commander. So there was some tweaking there. Then there was the 7 Weeks' War in 1866 between Prussia and Austria, which was a stunning victory for the Prussians. For militaries, defeat is always a far better tutor than victory, and the French had some hard lessons to learn from the Franco-Prussian War. Significant investment was made in innovation, in doctrine and equipment, and this led to the French adopting a philosophy of attaquer outrance, which translates to attack to excess. This philosophy was in response to the increase in defensive firepower, and it was thought that only dash, elan, courage, and sheer willpower would be sufficient to overcome defensive firepower. This is one of the classic lessons to come out of the First World War. How does innovation occur out of contact? So before the commencement of hostilities in World War I, with all of the technological innovation that's going on, and how do the lessons learned once contact is made, how are those lessons distilled down to develop the doctrine to be able to learn from the lessons of the battles as they are occurring? Incredibly difficult, and the problems in learning those lessons and adapting to the new technology is why the First World War was so costly in lives and took so long to resolve. And it's important to reference the casualties here, because this is where one part of the thinking is going to come from, the impact of the First World War on the French nation. So in 1914, there was 39.6 million people in France. I've got some figures here that I'll put up in the show notes. They are relatively rough, and full disclosure, I grabbed them off Wikipedia. And for some of the columns, I have averaged out where there were high and low ranges. But this is really just to give us a bit of an indication as to the impact on France I'm thinking from a psychological point of view. We want to be thinking about just what was the impact of the First World War on the French people. So they had 1.1 million KIA or MIA during the war. Total military deaths was almost 1.4 million troops killed. So that works out to be 3.47% of their entire population. They also had 40,000 civilian deaths who were either casualties from the war or victims of war crimes. And they also had 300,000 civilians who died from war-induced malnutrition or disease. This is 1 in 25 people died from the First World War. On top of that, there are 4.25 million military wounded casualties. So adding those two together, and you are now at 15% of the population who either died or were wounded in the war. That's 1 in 6 people. That's a profound impact. When we look at the percentage of military deaths as a percentage of the entire population, France's ratio is 3.5%. That's the third highest after Serbia at 8.3% and Romania at 4.5%. Both of those countries had significantly smaller populations. Russia and Germany had significantly more casualties, but Russia had 175 million people and Germany had 65 million people. For the French, post-World War I, there was a distinct move in philosophy for more balance on the defence, but with room to go over to the offence because they understood that the offence was required to be able to deliver the decisive blow. Their philosophy moved to a methodical battle with a focus on firepower. They understood the likelihood of another war with Germany. On the 11th of November 1918, Ferdinand Foch accepted the German request for an armistice. When the Treaty of Versailles was being signed, he thought that it was too lenient on Germany, and he declared, "This is not peace, this is an armistice for 20 years." And of course, that would prove to be quite prophetic because 1939 was when the Second World War would start. The 20s saw a codification of the lessons learned from the First World War, as well as the beginnings of the strategic discussion about what would be required to provide for the defence of France. The development for the French strategy for the defence of the nation had a significant constraint, and that was that much of her industrial capacity was located close to the frontiers with Germany. Much of their ability to fight a protracted war was located close to the German border. Now, much of the information that I'm going to be using for this analysis comes from an excellent book, The Seeds of Disaster, The Development of French Army Doctrine, 1919 to 1939, by Robert Doughty. He looked at a couple of key strategic resources that the French would need to fight a war against Germany. The first one was coal. They had 18 billion tonnes of coal reserves before World War II. However, in comparison, Germany had 423 billion and England had 190 billion. So they didn't have a lot of coal and much of it was close to the borders. The situation for iron ore was even worse. After the Franco-Prussian War, Germany acquired the province of Lorraine. This is the area where most of iron ore production occurred. France retained a small portion of that, and in 1913, 83% of the iron ore produced in France came from that part of Lorraine. When the war began in 1914, Germans seized the remainder of the Lorraine iron ore fields and completely halted iron ore production there. To make matters worse, military operations closed another 9% of pre-war production. This meant that each year, French iron ore production never exceeded 10% of what was produced in 1913. After the war, Lorraine was restored to France, and nearly 95% of the iron ore that was produced in 1932 came from Lorraine. Between World War I and World War II, these iron fields were the largest in Europe and the second largest known in the world, and the most economical of all to work. However, some of them were as close as a quarter of a mile from the border with Germany. So we have a critical input into the French economy, extremely close to their potential enemy. So 75% of France's coal and 95% of the iron ore production was very close to the German border. Now, the issue with this is, where does the heavy industry go? Generally, it's going to be close to those resources because that's the most economical way of using them. And what do you need to enable heavy industry to function? The workers. A major portion of France's population resided near these natural resources. And manpower for the French army had always been a significant problem. Since the Franco-Prussian War, the ratio of French to Germans had progressively declined. In the 1860s, the Germans slightly outnumbered the French in men aged 20 to 34. By 1910, that ratio had increased to 1.7 to 1 in favour of the Germans, and by 1939, the Germans had more than twice as many fighting-aged males. So this meant that for manpower reasons, as well as patriotic reasons, the French needed to retain those critical frontiers. The French had a couple of other constraints as they were looking for ways to defend their nation. Because of the disparity between the German and French population, France was unable to field a large standing army with a high level of readiness. It relied on a large reserve army, and so it required a significant amount of time for the mobilisation of that army. That manpower disparity went further though. They needed to conserve men wherever possible. The French High Command believed that it was going to be quite a long war, just as the First World War had been. The requirement was for a stopgap that would enable them the time to mobilise. Without trading space for time, they didn't have the land to be able to have strategic defence in depth, and indeed, because their infrastructure was so close to the frontiers in some places, there was often not the ability to have tactical defence in depth. Even though this was realised as one of the key learnings coming out of the First World War, that defence in depth enabled the grinding down of an offensive assault until it ran out of momentum. Some officers, like Charles de Gaulle, argued for an increase in tanks and aircraft. However, it was agreed that a series of forts should be built on the frontier. This would perform two tasks. Firstly, it would act as a significant deterrent to the Germans. Secondly, it would provide the time required for the mobilisation of the French army. The garrison troops required to defend the Maginot Line would be significant, but they would be a lot less than would have been required had they been field armies. So there is a conservation of manpower, and the defensive forts will dent the momentum of any German assault whilst providing the time for the mobilisation. Rather than an actual line of defences, it was more a series of forts and blockhouses. It ran from the borders with Italy, Switzerland, Germany and Luxembourg. The Belgian border was left undefended, and this was to allow for the French army to move through Belgium. This would enable the French army to fight on someone else's terrain rather than French home soil. Work commenced on the Maginot Line in 1930, and it was largely completed by 1939. It cost the French around $4 billion in US dollars today. So it was a significant investment in defence. The first line of the defence was the border post line, and this consisted of strong houses that were often camouflaged to look like residential houses. They were built very close to the border, and their purpose was to provide early warning and the initial delay to any surprise attack. Behind that were a series of anti-tank blockhouses. Their purpose, to slow up any assault, to provide the time required for the principal line of resistance to be manned. This was further back, preceded by anti-tank obstacles. These were generally metal rails buried in lines of 6 rows, and they would extend for hundreds of kilometres. Behind that was the barbed wire acting as the anti-personnel obstacle, with the French trying to separate an armoured assault from the infantry that were supporting it. There was then a series of various defensive works that had been developed. There were infantry casemates. These would be equipped with machine guns and anti-tank guns, either 37 or 47 millimetre. They would be manned by about 20 to 30 men who would be spread across 2 levels, and they would have electric power generation capability, reserves of water and fuel and food, as well as ventilation equipment. Then there were the petit ouvrages. These were the small works, and they would consist of several infantry bunkers that were connected by a tunnel network. These would have greater support infrastructure, such as mess halls, infirmaries, and supply caches, and their crew would be between 100 and 200 soldiers. There was also the gros ouvrages, which was the large works. They had the heaviest construction, the heaviest artillery, and they were manned with between 500 and 1,000 troops. I'll put some schematic diagrams up on the show notes just to give you an idea of the amount of work that went into the Maginot Line. The large works would even have narrow gauge railway systems moving between bunkers, so it was a significant facility. There were 2 types of artillery support in the Maginot Line. There were the garrison troops who would man the guns within the emplacements, and there were also mobile artillery formations that would be moved around and able to respond to the battle as it developed. So a large amount of time, money and materials was invested into the Maginot Line. It was a critical component of the French strategic defence plan. It was designed to either deter or deny the German army the opportunity to cross the frontier and invade France. So how did it actually perform? Surprisingly well. So apart from a small piercing of the defences along the Meuse River on the 13th of May, that was near Sedan, and we're going to get back to that. Apart from that, the Maginot Line worked as advertised. The first major assault by the Germans against the Maginot Line was on the 16th of May, and it was directed at an isolated fortification at Le Fert on the extreme western end of the line. The Le Fert defences consisted primarily of 2 blockhouses. Now, these had been built in 1934, and they weren't as strong as the earlier generation of blockhouses. The terrain wasn't ideal for the defence either. So it wasn't the best situation for the French. But despite these issues, the Germans only managed to capture the blockhouses after 3 days of very tough fighting. And that was with the support of large amounts of heavy artillery, including the feared 88mm gun. The Germans, seeing the difficulty that they'd had attacking this small outpost of the Maginot Line, did not attack the Maginot Line again for another month. In mid-June, the Germans attempted to seize fortresses in the Lutare sector. These were the fortresses at Fermont, Michelsberg and Argonaut. The Germans concentrated overwhelming firepower in these assaults, infantry, artillery and air power. They massed 88s, they brought up heavy 355mm and 420mm artillery, and numerous Luftwaffe attacks, but they accomplished little from the 19th to the 23rd of June. They ended up ceasing the ground attacks with the infantry, but continued on with artillery neutralisation of the fortresses. However, they were unable to capture a single major fortress before the armistice was signed on the 25th of June. They had better luck in the weaker defended areas with lighter defences though. Robert Doughty in his book has an interesting passage about the last fortress to fall, and I'll read from it here. In June 1940, the last units to surrender in the French army were those occupying the fortifications in the northeast and in the Alps. In the northeast, the fortress troops continued to resist despite being surrounded and having little or no contact with the high command. After suffering heavy casualties while attempting to capture the fortresses, the Germans informed the French government, which had surrendered, that if resistance continued, they would bombard the city of Lyon. General Georges sent 3 officers forward to arrange the surrender of the Maginot Line, and a week after the ceasefire, the fortress troops lowered the French flag and marched into captivity. Had the troops defending along the Ardennes done as well, the fate of France may have been different. I mentioned that earlier on when we talked about the piercing of the French defences on the 13th of May, as the Germans crossed in a weakly defended area. I don't want to preempt too much of what we're going to talk about in that episode. We are going to spend quite a bit of time talking about rubber boats and very rickety bridges as Panzergruppe Kleist moves across the Meuse River. It's an incredible story of amazing audacity in the face of the enemy and audacity in the face of higher command. But it does take 2 to tango, and where we see that incredible audacity, we also see the French inability to counter Heinz Guderian's reckless offence. 19th Army Corps under Heinz Guderian, as a part of Panzergruppe Kleist, is the German main effort in Fall Gelb. Why is the German main effort going up against the French centre of gravity? I think this is one of the central questions for the Battle of France. There are 3 points that I think are really important to consider in answering this. Firstly, this is potentially one of the worst terrain analysis that's ever been done in the history of military operations. Secondly, it is a severe case of groupthink. And lastly, it is a failure to appreciate the technological changes that have occurred between 1918 and 1939. These 3 factors lead Erich von Manstein to see the opportunity to take the indirect approach through the Ardennes forest. Yes, it's a winding road. Yes, the road is very narrow. There are a significant number of choke points and it is incredibly high risk. But the indirect approach is going to be the easier approach because no one expects him to take the indirect approach. The French had spent a number of years looking at the composition of where the blockhouses, casemates, and major fortifications would be placed as a part of the Maginot Line defences. However, one area where there was little disagreement was in the Ardennes forest. The Superior Council's debate for the war plans treated the Ardennes as an area of secondary concern. In 1927, the Guillemot Commission looked at the problem of the Ardennes and it assumed that it was easily defendable. The terrain was certainly not the terrain that armoured formations would be looking for, open plains. It consisted of winding roads, they were very narrow, heavily forested, the hills were steep, there were trees that could be felled, minefields that could be emplaced, roadblocks that would be quite easy to put in place, and that would create potentially the largest traffic jam in Europe ever. And it did create the largest traffic jam in Europe. You've not only got the Ardennes forest, you've then got the Meuse River, which is a very strong obstacle. Their analysis had shown that it would take the Germans 9 days to cross the Ardennes, giving them plenty of time to reinforce. The problem for them was that the Germans were able to cross the Ardennes in just 3 days, temporarily dislocating the French from their plans to reinforce this critical sector. What the French were expecting, what they were actively shaping the Germans towards, was to redo the Schlieffen Plan of 1914 as they moved through Belgium. What they weren't expecting is for the Germans to reuse the terrain from 1870 in the Sedan. In March 1940, a member of the French Parliamentary Army Committee, Pierre-Charles Taittinger, led a delegation to look at the defences in the Sedan. The defence of this area was the responsibility of the French 4th Army Group under General Charles Hunziger. Taittinger wrote in his report, In this region, we are entirely too much taken with the idea that the Ardennes Woods and the Meuse River will shield Sedan, and we assign entirely too much significance to these natural obstacles. The defences in this sector are rudimentary. And he wrote that he trembled at the thought that the Germans might attack there. If you saw my cryptic tweets while I was researching this episode, you'll have part of the story of Taittinger. He was a French cavalry officer in World War I. He'd actually suffered a heart attack and was sent to a hospital to convalesce. And that hospital was based in a chateau where champagne was made, and he would purchase that in 1932. That would become the House of Taittinger. With his eye for terrain, he was able to see what many in the French High Command were missing, or refused to see. And when he was asked if he was worried about Taittinger's report, he said, "Certainly not. The Germans are dead afraid of attacking." And on the 9th of May, so less than 24 hours before the invasion, Hunsinger told his troops, "The German preparations which you have observed are only an exercise. The Germans are not crazy enough to take the additional risk of facing 27 Belgian divisions." In retrospect, it wasn't the Maginot Line that let down the French defence. It was a flawed implementation of the Maginot Line based on one of the most flawed terrain analyses in the history of military operations. That flawed analysis, compounded by groupthink amongst all of the planners for the defence of France, set the conditions for the flawed implementation of the defence of the Sedan area, an area that had been invaded only 70 years prior. But this wasn't the worst mistake that the French High Command made. Like the Maginot Line, the campaign plan was set in concrete. It was unwilling to flex in response to changes in the operational environment as they developed. This strategic inflexibility led to an operational plan that wouldn't consider contingencies. This inflexibility devolved down to the tactical level and the way in which the French would fight. But flexibility, or lack thereof, amongst the German, British and French will be a story for another day.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.